Hello, everybody. Welcome to this edition of Flex in the City. And today I have Paul Brady with me, who works for Franklin Templeton and has done an enormous amount for the LGBT cause in financial services. So we are very honoured to have Paul on the podcast today. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Rachel. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
It's a great pleasure to have you here. And to kick off, I'm very curious to find out a little bit more about you and your own story and how you came to be an SVP at Franklin Templeton in the UK.
So, yeah, I've actually worked in the city now for probably 35 years. And I left school at 18, having grown up in East London. I went to school and I left school at 18 and went to work in a bank.
So you're a Cockney, are you, Paul?
Nearly.
Nearly.
I'm a Mockney, more importantly, I would suggest. But I ended up working in NatWest Bank actually at the age of 18. And I stayed there for a few years. I did all kinds of things, including serving on the till and filing things away and all those starting out jobs that people do at 18. I was actually a management trainee, although I think I was a long way from managing anything at that time, apart from myself. My friends left and I decided I should leave. It was about the time of Big Bang. Everything was changing. And I found myself working for SG Warburg & Co., the merchant bank. And I was working then in what they would call the custody operations. So again, I was very much at a grassroots level. I left my management training program and I started working filing share certificates and getting share certificates out of custody drawers. And so I have a good background in custody because I actually did it in a time when there was really paper everywhere. Yeah. So I remember I said to my boss at the time, you know, I didn't leave my management training program to come and do filing. And she said to me, you work for SG Warburg, you will do as you're told. So that was a great baptism of what it's like to work in a traditional British firm at that time. So it was a different world.
And how long were you working for SG Warburg for, Paul?
Well, I actually worked for that company through 15 years, although in that time we had 5 owners. So our division was spun off to different people, and I ended up working for the Bank of New York at the end.
Oh, wow.
And I was working, at that time I was working as a VP. I've done all kinds of things in my career, from data input to project management, product management. I've been a people leader, I've been a relationship manager, I've had the pleasure of working with people from all over the world, but in those days I was very much focused on retail customer service, and that's now turned into transfer agency, and here I am, a lifetime later. But it's been an interesting journey and I've been very fortunate, very, very fortunate. It's a combination of opportunity and luck and capability, I think.
Wow. And so tell me a little bit more about, you're an openly gay man in the city. How long have you been out in the city, so to speak?
Well, so I think when I started my career, it was a very different world to the one we live in now. So I spent quite a long time peeping out of a closet. I was actually very fortunate in that I met my life partner when I was 21. And so for a long time, I had my partner and I lived together. But in the work sense, I was kind of one of the boys, and I spent a lot of time with my colleagues, and my partner was a bit of a secret. I think when I joined Franklin Templeton in 2001, I actually became much more explicit about my sexual orientation, also about my partner. This firm is a great firm because when I joined, I could actually disclose that he would receive my spousal benefits. We had those policies in those days, and that was something that attracted me to the firm in the first place.
Right.
And probably in the last 5 years, I've been much more explicit and open about my sexual orientation. I went on a program with Stonewall of executive leadership, and I learned that it was my duty and my obligation to be an out gay role model in the workplace. And for me, that was quite a revelation, because it hadn't occurred to me that there was a wider purpose to being an out gay role model. And if you look throughout the city, there are less gay role models than there should be. And there are very few openly gay leaders in our industry. And I'm very happy to be able to be an out gay leader and be able to role model and hopefully inspire others to be their whole selves in the workplace. Certainly in the last few years, I have taken executive sponsorship role of our Pride Network globally. I am our diversity and inclusion champion for the UK, but also my husband and I have featured on our global intranet site. I've met all kinds of colleagues around the globe who tell me how nice it is to see me out there. I've given other people courage and inspired them to come out and be their whole selves of the workplace.
Yeah, how much courage has that taken from you, Paul, to take on that role?
I think I needed a lot more courage when I was younger, actually, Rachel. As a fully rounded person, it's easy to have more courage. I think my problem was I didn't recognize how important that role would be. So I figured people just understood I was a gay leader and that was fine. I've actually never felt like I was taking a risk, certainly here, in being an out gay leader. I have to say I've felt much happier and much more confident in the workplace since I did do that. And it sounds kind of ironic because people have known I've been gay for as long as I've worked here. But actually, you know, standing up and talking about it, talking about my husband in a conversation when others are talking about their families and their wives is very liberating. And for many years, that wasn't really possible, not because people have told me it wasn't possible, but because there was an element of, I don't know, self-censorship, not wanting to cause jeopardy to my career, particularly when you're making your way in the world. And that's why it's so important for someone like me or in other firms to demonstrate the power of leadership, because it can inspire others to be their whole self. And had I been inspired by an LGBT leader when I was younger, who knows how much more I could have achieved. I feel comfortable with where I got to in my career, but I really think the worrying about what others think is a big burden for people in the workplace. And if you come from a strand of diversity where you feel there's some kind of prejudice or issue for you, you self-censor to fit in, and that's never going to be a successful outcome for you, I think.
Absolutely.
It impairs your success. People sense you're not genuine, and authenticity and being genuine in the workplace are things that make you successful.
Absolutely. I'm sure you'll be aware that living here in Luxembourg, that we have the first openly gay Prime Minister of the Western world, the wonderful Xavier Bettel, who talks regularly at conferences about that sort of courage and really encourages people to take that leadership space. So I find your story very interesting, and naturally we hope to get Xavier on the show at some point. So I'd love to ask you.
I feel very proud to be in that company, actually, Rachel. I saw his speech to the United Nations, and I actually posted it on our Pride and our Diversity and Inclusion global network so that people could see it. And I, you know, particularly at a time where there's so much discourse and so much anger about political leaders, I thought what he had to say to the UN was truly inspiring. So I thought it was a wonderful piece of diplomacy and humanity.
Absolutely. And so what do you think are the key challenges for LGBT plus people in financial services today, those who are up and coming? What challenges still exist for them, Paul?
Well, I think there are still barriers to success for everybody, particularly some of them being barriers that you introduce for yourselves. That's definitely the case. I think as an LGBT person in financial services, I think the world has changed sufficiently for you to be yourself and be successful. Certainly here in the City of London, almost every asset manager now has a Pride or an LGBT plus network. There are groups, networks of networks called Interinvest, which Franklin and other firms are part of. I think there is awareness, there is acceptance, and there is understanding from corporations about needing to get the best from their employees. But I do think people face prejudice. If it's not in the workplace, it's outside the workplace. I mean, I think there are always situations where you hear of people who've experienced some kind of assault or verbal abuse, and that cuts across many strands of diversity, including LGBT+. So the world is not a safe and cuddly place for everybody, but I think in financial services in the city, for most firms, it feels to me like there's truly an agenda to make people comfortable in the workplace. But I think as an individual, you've got to work out, and one of the challenges you have as a new entrant to our industry is to work out whether you can be your whole self and whether that organization welcomes you. And it's quite sad in a way that you have to make that, you have to kind of assess how things are around here. And I think we all join organizations and try and work out how things work, but there's also an added angle for LGBT plus people, which says, how do things work and can I be who I really am? I think there's some startling statistics which suggest a large percentage of graduates, when they graduate and come into the city, go back into the closet. And that,
interesting.
I don't think that's necessarily because the environment is particularly challenging or difficult, but there's an element of saying, I'm not sure what I need to be to get on here. And I think firms have got to try much harder to welcome people and be clear, it's okay around here. We welcome you and we want your perspective and we want who you are. We want your capabilities. We're not worried about things that are not relevant to you being successful.
So can you think, Paul, of a leader in financial services that has maybe encouraged you to bring your whole self? Is there someone you can think of in the time that you've been working in the city?
So I think historically, one of my prior organisations, I worked for a gentleman called Frank Parker. He was a great role model as a leader. He was a very kind, humane person. He encouraged me to be who I was in the workplace, even though it was a time when it was less discussed and less visible. So he was probably my most inspiring, and that was probably in the middle part of my career where I was learning to be a leader. So I found he had a profound impact on my self-confidence and my ability to be successful. And I think for leaders, you've got to be able to do that. I also think, and she's no longer in financial services, well, if insurance counts as financial services, but I think Inga Beale, as the CEO of Lloyd's of London, as an out-by woman, is a very impressive person when you hear her speak, and in terms of her journey. So I think she's also someone I find very inspiring, and what in an industry that is has a reputation for being pretty stuffy, insurance, I think she was like a breath of fresh air. And certainly hearing her talk about some of her experiences and the way people behaved until she started explaining what wasn't acceptable anymore, it is really very inspiring. And I think for all leaders, you know, explaining what's not acceptable is part of leadership, and role modeling what you shouldn't be doing, and talking about role modeling what you should be doing and talking about what you shouldn't be doing is absolutely essential.
Absolutely.
And here I try to talk about what's not okay and what is okay, particularly and when you see people say things, you have to remind them, should we really be talking like that in this day and age? Is that really the kind of workplace we have? And it's a kind way of doing it without being rude, but people realise, you know, sometimes people forget the boundaries. I think that's the problem.
And out of curiosity, how often do you have to do that, Paul?
From time to time. And I think it also varies when you're dealing with people from other cultures. I have a workforce in 14 countries. So part of the challenge is not applying my own values to everything that happens. And equally, people from other cultures don't always understand the impact of what's being said in a different place. So it's actually, culture is an overlay. What's acceptable in different places can vary. One of the things we try to do is have an inclusive culture across the world. But you've also got to respect societal norms and societal difference. You know, India is a very conservative culture.
Yep.
Also, you know, and inclusion there is much more about gender. In the US, it's a litigious society, and there's much more awareness of people's human rights and personal entitlements. And so again, there's a different level of sensitivity required. And sometimes, you know, authenticity is harder in that environment because people can't be themselves in case there's a cause for offence. And I think for everyone in our world, the risk for us is being oversensitive. We've got to respect difference, but it doesn't mean we can't talk about it, and we can't talk about it respectfully. That's also important.
Absolutely. And I think if you listen to some of Xavier Bettel's speeches, he says some things that are very similar to the things that you're echoing there. So just moving outside of financial services just for a second, a little bird tells me, and I don't know why it is, on Flex in the City, we seem to attract football fans. I don't know why that is, but we had Ian Holden, who really loved the leadership style of Pep Guardiola. And we've had Mike Tumblety, who I believe you know, who really loves the leadership style of Sir Alex Ferguson. As you're a football fan, is there a leader in the football world that you admire, and why do you admire them?
As a long-term Arsenal fan, I think it would be remiss of me not to tell you that I really have a sort of man crush on Arsene Wenger in terms of his ability to lead and inspire a team. I think the reason I think he's is a great person and a great leader is over a period of time he refreshed his teams, and I don't think he gets enough credit for the way he transformed the way Arsenal Football Club ran. I also think that he had a man management style which enabled him to get the best out of everybody. And yes, there's lots of criticism because when you survive for 22 years in that game, there's criticism. But I think he's a role model of someone who's working in a different culture, working with a group of diverse individuals and bringing them together and getting the best out of them. And I think, he, in many ways, he's credited with transforming the approach of English football by doing just that. And when he was appointed, there was headlines about Arsene who, and I think when he left, he probably left with more brickbats than he deserved. So I'd love to have dinner with him one night and talk to him about exactly what happened and how he found his time in English football, because I think for me that would be he's a very engaging person when you see him interviewed. I imagine he must be phenomenal company over supper.
Absolutely. And so do you think there are more challenges for inclusion in football or in financial services, Paul?
Well, I think football, interestingly, has a very mixed, there's a great deal of diversity in terms of race and culture and difference. Mm-hmm. But obviously there's a great deal of difference. Female football is underrepresented in the global game. Mm-hmm. Only in recent years have we seen female football being taken seriously, and I think that's a great thing. Mm-hmm. I do think, obviously, from an LGBT plus point of view, women's football is way more inclusive of lesbian players than the men's game is of gay players. And there must be gay players who are active, but I don't think, maybe the tribalism, I don't know. Football finds it very hard to accept anything that's vaguely different when it comes to gay players. And having spent a long time on the terraces, I've heard things in the past. I've heard people's attitudes. I'm actually a member of the Gay Gooners, which is the largest LGBT football network for gay fans. So I think we have 900 members. Uh-huh. And Arsenal have been terrific in supporting that. But I'm a member from a distance. I'm not actively engaged in activities, but I follow. And I think that's pushing forward inclusion. There are many clubs now with LGBT networks. And I think that is actually changing the face. Whether any player ever finds the courage to be different in the dressing room while they're active, it's going to happen. It's just a question of when. I mean, ideally, it would be amazing if a superstar actually announced that, or somebody announced it and went on to be a superstar. That would be even more inspiring. In the way that Raheem Sterling has really changed public perception about him as an individual, about the way he represents himself and his background. I think, I'd love to see that translated into LGBT inclusion in football. But it's more an aspiration than I think a reality currently, and it's very sad. It's very sad. I think rugby sets an example of what's possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So, Paul, what are the two traits that you think have brought your own success as a leader in financial services?
For me, that's a challenging question. I think I'm very curious, so that helps a lot. So I am interested to learn. I'm interested in understanding why things are the way they are. Google is an amazing tool for me because I spend so much time Googling stuff that's probably irrelevant to most people, just in my desire to understand. So, a small example, I happened to be watching a football match yesterday where Chichester City, my local team, were on TV, and I thought, I don't know very much about them, and off I was to Wikipedia. So my curiosity, I think, is enabled me to be interested in things, to be successful when you set out in a global environment, which when I came to Franklin, I was suddenly in a global firm. I'd been really in a UK firm. I had to learn about people in other places. I had to be accepting as difference, and I had to be curious about how life is, and that's helped me. So that curiosity has been phenomenal. The other thing I think is I'm quite outgoing and outspoken. I'm also, my parents instilled in me that you get nothing without putting anything in. So, you know, my parents have always encouraged me to work hard. And, you know, I did a paper round at 14. I've worked since I was 14, really, in order to finance my way in the world, and nothing's ever been handed to me. So I believe in, you know, hard work and commitment. So that can be challenging when you have people who imagine the world is going to owe them or going to do something for them. And that, so for me as an aging leader, I have to remember the world has changed. And managing intergenerational workforces is also challenging because expectations of what leadership should be have changed. You know, once upon a time, your boss told you to be grateful for a job, as I said. Now your boss is here to encourage you to come and be your whole self and do the best you can do and experiment and be creative. That's challenging when you run a process where it has to work right all the time. But, you know, I think it's a very interesting challenge for any new modern manager to be a person that can adapt. And at some point, you know, I will move on to greener pastures in later life. And hopefully I'll have learned all my way along. And hopefully I learn enough to know when it's time to go. Unlike my great role model, Arsene Wenger, perhaps.
So talking about legacy, Paul, what advice would you give to future financial services leaders about inclusion and what they should do or who they should be?
Well, I think, you know, to be successful in leadership, I mean, there's lots of studies, lots of editorial about authenticity. So I think as a leader, particularly in financial services, where there's an element of trying to fit in and fit into a cookie cutter of how to manage, authenticity and sincerity are part of building inclusion. Because inclusion is not just about different strands of diversity, but it's also about hearing people, seeing people, taking notice of what they've got to say, being challenged about what you think may not be right. Because I think unless you have, you know, inclusivity of ideas and challenge as a leader, you can be very one-dimensional. And knowing the answer and saying, look where I am, I know what I'm talking about, sets you up for failure in the long term. So I think you've got to be able to accept other perspectives and include them into the way to make decisions and think about your leadership, definitely. I think if you're starting out, you know, it's hard for me to know what will be required for the next 30 years, because I think when I started out 30 years ago, I had no clue that I would be an LGBT role model talking on a podcast about what it takes for inclusive leadership. And I don't think I ever really got the handbook that helped me do that. I mean, it's through experience and opportunity that I've been given a chance to get to here, I think, and, you know.
So I'm interested in, I know you're interested in products and product development, Paul. And when I look at financial services products, I always think about my mum and dad and the fact that they probably can't understand what these products are, the way in which they're communicated. perhaps needs to be changed. But what do you think about the future of products and solutions is in financial services for people that are different and this ever increasing inclusive world? What do you think needs to be done in that area?
I think what you've said, I think, is a great point, because the perception of financial services outside our industry is that it's a very dull, very complicated place. It's a place where people don't have your best interests at heart. There's an element of people seeking to make money from investments of the public. I don't think the public necessarily perceive that our industry has their interests at heart. Not only that, I think if you look at the way our products are marketed and publicized in the marketplace, you don't see a great deal of inclusive advertising or inclusive editorial or role models that show that these products are designed for the future, for the young, for people who are different. And I think one of the biggest challenges for our industry is, how do we really demonstrate to everybody that taking care of your life savings to help you build a future for yourself is what we're here for. And that includes everybody across all stratas of society, all strands of diversity. 20 years ago, there was a financial advisor called Ivan Massow who sold financial services products to the LGBT community. But I don't think in those 20 years we've seen a much more mainstream attempt to appeal to multi-market groups by the financial services industry. I think also, investing in a pension is probably one of the smartest things you can do as a young person. But when did you ever see an advert which encouraged a young person to open a pension? You didn't. And I think the industry is missing an opportunity and needs to adapt and work out that what got us here is not going to get us to the next level. There's a lot of talk about the cost of products, but there's not a lot of talk about why these products are valuable to you as a person. And if you think about insurance, everyone understands why they need insurance. But I'm not sure everyone understands why they need to plan for their future when they're older. And nor is there's probably a little bit of a trust deficit in terms of what financial products will give to you as an individual. You mentioned my parents. My father is very happy with his investments that he made 30 years ago. He put a small amount in an ISA with another well-known asset manager. And every time he gets his quarterly dividend check to me, he rings me up to tell me, I've got my income. It's amazing. And did you know it's only gone up again this year? He's not bothered about relative performance. He's not bothered about indices. He's happy to get a level of income that makes him feel happy as a retired person and know that his nest egg is still pretty safe, in his opinion. So, I think for us, we overcomplicate the story and we forget that the consumer really wants something that makes them feel good. They don't know if it's the best. They're not bothered about it's the best. They just want to feel like their outcome is fair and what they were expecting. And I think that's a message for us in life as well as in financial services. Let's make people feel like life is fair and what people need is catered for. So I'm sorry, but I feel very passionately that sometimes the industry overcomplicates things.
I couldn't agree more, Paul. Couldn't agree more. So my final question to you is, I've given you a magic wand, and your magic wand allows you to change something in financial services for the better. What do you do, Paul?
So I think, first off, I would say it would be lovely to see more LGBT leadership in our industry. There are LGBT colleagues in our industry, and I think it would be great to see more senior leaders, more visible role models across the industry, across all strands of all types of firms, custodians, asset managers, banks. And I think, as well as that, I think at middle management, it would be good to see people having the confidence to be themselves in the workplace, because I think with authentic leadership, that gives people a real chance to be successful in the long term. And it's part of a broader need for our industry to have more diverse voices in senior leader roles. I think we're making a great effort on gender inclusion, but talk about Black is there, BAME are underrepresented, LGBT are underrepresented. I think it's all about having more inclusive leadership in general, and I'd love to see that in financial services. I think the industry is really beginning to grasp that task, and there are many firms moving forward with efforts to broaden that. So that's one thing I'd love to see. I think secondly, I would love us to be able to encourage our young people at an earlier age to learn more about financial literacy, to better understand how to save and how to plan for their futures, and to have a greater sense of responsibility for their own financial future and be clear about what they can achieve with a small amount of investment over a period of time, and believe that our industry is aligned to their aspirations. And I think those two things would make a significant difference to our industry, because particularly with young people, they would view positively the industry and the benefit it brings to them in terms of helping them grow their life savings, as it were, for the future.
Paul, thank you so much for being our guest on Flex in the City. We've absolutely loved having you, and you are a real model for the LGBT plus community and more. I think you are a role model as a leader for this diverse, inclusive world that we live in. So thank you very much for joining us, Paul.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel. I appreciate it.